Pursuity Wave. The official IPOT signature series. Available now at riseattireusa.com.
This is Sir Patrick Mack, and I approve this message.
Chefs français, soldats, marins, aviateurs, fonctionnaires, colons français d'Afrique du Nord, levez-vous, aidez nos alliés, joignez-vous à eux sans réserve. La France qui combat vous en adjure. Ne vous souciez pas des noms ni des formules. Une seule chose compte, le salut de la patrie.
January 21st, 1943. The ANFA Conference, or Casablanca Conference, is held at the ANFA Hotel in Casablanca, French Morocco. Here, the Allied forces discussed the European strategy moving forward. In attendance, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Moroccan Sultan Mohammed V, French generals Charles de Gaulle and Henri Giraud. General Secretary of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, declined due to the ongoing battle in Stalingrad. Here, the Combined Bomber Offensive Directive was adopted, calling for the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic systems, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. The United States Air Force would raid during the day, while the Royal Air Force and Polish squadrons bombed by night, led by Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, who in May signed Bomber Command Order No. 173, otherwise known as Operation Gomorrah, named for the biblical firestorm on Sodom and Gomorrah. On July 15, Churchill gave the approval to use chaff, a relatively new tool used to create interference with German radar by dispersing tiny pieces of foil in the air. On July 24, the bombing began. The city of Hamburg first to be hit. The first attacks lasting nearly an hour, 791 aircraft, 2,400 tons of explosives. High explosive bombs first to destroy roofs and covers, then incendiary ordnance. The fires lasted 3 days. The second raid featured 90 B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft, destroying aircraft engine factories in Blanc and Vos. By the third night, there was still so much smoke that the third raid had to be postponed, and 700 bombers were sent to Essen instead. But the bombs would return again, and on the nights of July 27 and 28, nearly 800 Royal Air Force aircraft continued to rain down on Hamburg. The intense bombing and heat created a thermal cyclone with a diameter of over 2 miles, winds up to 150 miles per hour, and temperature in the center of 800 degrees, destruction for 13 miles long. Anything wooden, paper, or fabric burned. Lead, aluminum, and bricks melted to liquid. Those who hid in bomb shelters likely died of suffocation. Even as rescue crews and survivors made their way to the surface, the bombing continued. Another 700 aircraft arrived the next day. More than 42,000 people killed, many civilians. 1 million were left homeless. In Hamburg alone, 69 more bombings would follow over the course of the war. And Hamburg wouldn't be the only city to experience such awesome devastation. Next came Berlin, Nuremberg, Cologne, Stuttgart, Darmstadt, Würzburg, Munich, all suffering the same horrific fate. After a first wave, a second would come, hoping to catch rescuers, responders, and fleeing survivors. Never would I have thought that death could come to so many people in so many different ways. Sometimes the victims looked like ordinary people, apparently peacefully sleeping. The faces of others were racked with pain. The bodies stripped almost naked by the tornado. There were wretched refugees from the east, clad only in rags, and people from the opera in all their finery. Here, the victim was a shapeless slab. There, a layer of ashes. Across the city, along the streets, wafted the unmistakable stench of decaying flesh. One by one, German cities fell. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris was determined to wipe every German city out of existence. Harris estimated that a series of concerted bomb attacks such as this could kill 900,000 people in 18 months, injuring 1 million more, and destroying tens of millions of homes, leading to a humanitarian crisis that would force the collapse of the Reich. Harris was well aware of the fact that he was bombing civilians. I mention this because for a long time, the government, for excellent reasons, has preferred the world to think that we still held some scruples and attacked only what the humanitarians are pleased to call military targets. I can assure you, gentlemen, that we tolerate no scruples.
When the storm bursts over Germany, they will look back to the days of Lubeck and Rostock and Cologne, as a man caught in the blasts of a hurricane will look back to the gentle zephyrs of last summer. There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. Germany, clinging ever more and more desperately to her widespread conquests and foolishly striving for more, will make a most interesting initial experiment. Japan will provide the confirmation.
By early 1945, it was clear that Nazi Germany was about to fall. News of a Nazi death factory at Auschwitz in Poland would paint the Germans as war criminals. Little attention was spent covering their annihilation. In February of 1945, U.S. President Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met in Soviet Crimea at Yalta for the Argonaut Conference. Most of this conference was spent discussing allocation of territory. Deputy Chief of the Soviet General Staff, Alexei Antonov, was the one to propose a similar bombing campaign in the East, resulting in a promise by Churchill and Roosevelt to continue bombing in order to allow the advancement of Russian forces. Their next target would be the cultural haven of Dresden, a city that until now received very little damage from attack, perhaps because of its abundance of Baroque architecture, Neolithic pottery, art museums, and palaces and cathedrals. Dresden was considered a target, but not necessarily an industrial city, although surrounding areas were. The city had only experienced a few small skirmishes, perhaps because it housed Allied POWs to the tune of around 25,000. It was also home to nearly 500,000 refugees who had fled the Soviet persecution from the Bolsheviks just years before. By February of 1945, Hitler had lost lives, time, and dwindling fuel in a costly gamble during the offensive at Ardennes. By the 8th, the Allied operations Veritable, Blockbuster, and Grenade had commenced on the Eastern Front. Thanks to the unrelenting bombing campaigns, the Soviets succeeded with the Vistula Order offensive, which brought the Soviets closer to Berlin, now sustaining more bombings than any other city. Dresden was a central rail hub, with lines to Berlin, Prague, Munich, Vienna, Hamburg, Leipzig, and Breslau. While German citizens were out celebrating Fasching or German Mardi Gras, the air raid sirens began. Women and children lined the streets in costume. Most ignored the sirens, as Dresden had been spared for quite some time, 171 times. But at 10:09, the bombs began. For nearly a half hour, Allied bombers pummeled the city, blowing anyone in the center to bits. Small fires became infernos. Those who ran to shelters suffocated. In minutes, one of Europe's most prized cultural centers was reduced to rubble. Zoo and circus animals and performers, hospitals and rail stations were all targeted. Thousands fell, later tens of thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands of deaths. Hours later, as those who escaped death or found shelter arose to the surface, another raid began. By this time, thousands of fires erupted all over Dresden, smoke rising to 15,000 feet. 18,000 tons of ordnance in only 23 minutes. Bombs that set off fire tornadoes could incinerate a human in nearly an instant. Witnesses reported many adults being shrunken to the size of a child from the intense heat, others fainting from a lack of oxygen.
To my left, I suddenly see a woman. I can see her to this day and shall never forget it. She carries a bundle in her arms. It is a baby. She runs, she falls, and the child flies in an arc into the fire. Suddenly I saw people again right in front of me. They scream and gesticulate with their hands, and then, to my utter horror and amazement, I see how one after the other, they simply seem to let themselves drop to the ground. Today I know that these unfortunate people were the victims of lack of oxygen. They fainted and then burnt to cinders. Insane fear grips me, and from then on I repeat one simple sentence to myself continuously. I don't want to burn to death. I do not know how many people I fell over. I know only one thing, that I must not burn.
How was it? It was evil. I don't really know what you expect me to say when you say how was it. Thousands of firebombs dropping all over the place, explosions, heat, fire. People screaming, people burning, people alight. Well, it wasn't. After about half an hour, it started developing into something which was really bad. And so you go out and you come out there and the whole place is a furnace. It's a furnace. Because we were in the centre of Dresden. I've been through 6 years of war. I've lost all but 3 of the 28 blokes I joined up with in 1937. I've been in every battle in the Middle East. I've been in Italy, I'd come home, I'd been captured at Arnhem, but nothing prepared me for seeing women and children alight and flying through the air. Nothing prepared me for that. We were supposed to be the good guys. We was going to war to rescue Europe from the evil of the Third Reich. And we finished up being worse than they were.
The next morning, as those who were still able to survive assembled in the town square, the low rumble of the bombers returned. U.S. bombers and fighters directed their way to the survivors, slaughtering women, children, and animals. 10 more minutes of terror, which would repeat the next day and the day after that. The bodies piled up so high that they had to be stacked on girders and burned with flamethrowers. Over 200,000 bodies recovered, but tens of thousands more were refugees, and because so many bodies had been burned beyond recognition, it's likely that hundreds of thousands more were massacred. More people died in the Dresden bombings than that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. 2 days, 3,900 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs on civilians. The entire city laid to waste. Hospitals, churches, schools, homes, and yet hardly any military installations or targets hit. Nearly 500,000 killed. a true Holocaust, one that is rarely mentioned in the history books or by university professors. These atrocities were not limited to air raids and bombings. In October of '44, as the Soviets were advancing on the Eastern Front, thanks to the large-scale aerial attacks, the rural German town of Nemmersdorf would experience the brutality of the Soviet Red Army.
In the farmyard stood a cart to which more naked women were nailed through their hands in a cruciform position. Near a large inn, the Roterkrug, stood a barn, and to each of its 2 doors a naked woman was nailed through the hands in a crucified posture. In the dwellings we found a total of 72 women, including children, and 1 old man, 74, all dead. Some babies had their heads bashed in.
Actual numbers have been debated for years. Nonetheless, it was a massacre upon civilians, leaving nearly the entire town dead. Other nearby towns received similar treatment. In Mettgetten, 60 women found in a demented state who had been raped 60 to 70 times a day. At the same town's rail station, a refugee train from Königsberg was found with numerous mutilated bodies inside. Over 150 raped Catholic nuns in Nice. In Mecklenburg, around 800 citizens committed suicide rather than face the violence that would come with the Soviets. Children were found dead with their tongues nailed to the tables. The girls would be raped.
All of us knew very well that if the girls were German, they would be raped and then shot. This was almost a combat distinction.
I waited for the Red Army for days and nights. I waited for my liberation, but now our soldiers treat us far worse than the Germans did. They do terrible things to us.
In February of 1945, at Neustetten, 500 uniformed women of the Reichswomen's Labor Service were raped, tortured, and mutilated, only to be discovered by German soldiers a few days later. Girls as young as 10, raped by up to 20 soldiers.
In numerous instances, before troops pushed on, they turned to the helpless civilians and warned,
"The Mongols are coming. Very bad men. You go quick, go quick."
Terrified by the news, many Germans did attempt to flee. Most, however, found themselves trapped. Other than destroy liquor and hide young girls, most could only watch the clock and pray that their worst fears were unfounded. After a wait of sometimes days, but normally hours, the dreaded second wave arrived. Composed largely of Mongols and other Asians, as well as convicts, these men who formed the second wave of troops were regarded, even by their own comrades, as utterly merciless. Leading this group were the communist commissars, the fanatical political officers composed almost exclusively of Jews. These hate-filled individuals acted as the more than willing orchestrators of the horrors that befell the German people. Of all the methods used to express its hatred, the Red Army said it best with rape.
And when the first Russians came, the combat troops, they came in and wanted to see everything. Asked about weapons and soldiers, looked at everything closely, didn't find anything, and were very friendly, and then just left. And then the next lot arrived. The next one took me outside straight away. My mother wanted to throw herself in front of me, but she was pushed back. And then they took me upstairs, and as I tried to defend myself, he showed me his gun. And then, when I came back down, I was, well, shocked, but I was just happy that I was still alive. They said, "Woman, come." They said it in German. Frau, komm, in German. We were the prize. It was always like that.
An estimated 2,000 rapes in just a few days of Soviet occupation. Not only were many of these stories not reported in news media, the opposite narrative was the prevailing theme. Writers such as Ilya Ehrenberg, who published works such as The Black Book of Soviet Jewry, also created leaflets, which were dropped onto the battlefield and cities. His propaganda was sponsored by the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee,
Ilya spoke at numerous rallies in the U.S., attempting to garner support for the communist cause. He would display bars of soap that he claimed was being made from the corpses of dead Jews. But Ehrenberg was not calling simply for the death of German soldiers, but the rape and murder of civilians. It would be Ehrenberg who on December 22, 1944, would mention the Kabbalistic claim of 6 million alleged Jewish victims, a cry which had been published years before Hitler had even stepped into office.
Гитлеровцы подобрали антисемитизм. Они воскресили забытые предрассудки, осмеянные суеверия. Фашистов не переубеждают, фашистов убивают.
By autumn of 1945, thousands of refugees attempted to escape the encroachment of the Red Army and the Poles. They fled to the seaside town of Schwinnemund, which only had 22,000 inhabitants, although thousands more would arrive later. This did not deter Red Army Marshal Sergei Kudyakov, who requested to American General Karl Spaatz for an Allied bombing raid upon hearing news of the arrival of the new refugees. 671 flying fortresses and a multitude of fighter jets dropped payload after payload on the fleeing Germans. Over 1,600 bombs dropped almost entirely on the city's center. 6 full transport vessels were sunk. With the sinking of the Andros, 570 people went down with it, another with nearly 2,000. Cemetery, police, hospital records, and eyewitnesses all estimate the death toll at 23,000.
In a deliberate attempt to kill as many refugees as possible, Soviet submarines struck again and again at the slow-moving ships. Soon after midnight on February 10th, an old luxury liner, the General Steuben, was plowing through the icy black Baltic. Heavily weighed down with refugees and wounded soldiers, the ship was in the midst of its second such evacuation in less than a fortnight. Just before 1 a.m., 2 torpedoes slammed into the ship's side. As the Steuben's stern rose high out of the water, hundreds leaped overboard, including some who were torn to pieces by the still turning propellers. Within 7 minutes, the ship plunged beneath the waves, swiftly silencing a final mass scream that seemed to arise from a single voice. Of the 3,500 passengers aboard, only a few hundred survived.
On the Western Front, most Germans had not fled, but awaited the American and British, hoping they would receive much better treatment from them than their Soviet counterparts. But unfortunately, because of the bombardment of Jewish propaganda, many Americans were just as hate-filled. Led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, more than 1,700,000 German prisoners of war would die due to starvation, exposure, and disease. God, I hate the Germans.
So beginnt ein steigender Einfluss des amerikanischen Präsidenten, sich in dem Sinn auszuwirken, Konflikte zu schaffen oder vorhandene Konflikte zu vertiefen, auf alle Fälle aber zu verhindern, dass Konflikte eine friedliche Lösung finden. Jahrelang hat dieser Mann schon einen einzigen Wunsch, dass irgendwo in der Welt ein Streit ausbricht, am besten in Europa, der die Möglichkeit gibt, durch Verpflichtung der amerikanischen Wirtschaft an einen der beiden Streitenden eine politische Interessenverflechtung herzustellen, die geeignet sein konnte, Amerika einen solchen Konflikt langsam näher zu bringen und damit die Aufmerksamkeit von seiner zerfahrenen Wirtschaftspolitik im Inneren nach außen hin abzulenken. Besonders riskant wird sein Vorgehen in diesem Sinn gegen das Deutsche Reich. Vom Jahr 1937 ab setzten eine Anzahl von Rednern, darunter eine besonders niederträchtige vom 5. Oktober 1937 in Chicago, in dem dieser Mann planmäßig beginnt, die amerikanische Öffentlichkeit gegen Deutschland aufzuhetzen. Er droht mit der Aufrichtung einer Art von Quarantäne gegen die sogenannten autoritären Staaten. Im Vollzug dieser sich nun dauernd steigenden Hass- und Hetzreden des Präsidenten Roosevelt beruft er nach neuerlichen beleidigenden Erklärungen den amerikanischen Botschafter in Berlin zur Berichterstattung nach Washington. Seitdem sind die beiden Staaten nur noch durch Geschäftsträger miteinander verbunden. Im November 1938 ab beginnt er planmäßig und bewusst jede Möglichkeit einer europäischen Befriedungspolitik zu sabotieren. Er heuchelt dabei nach außen hin Interesse am Frieden, droht aber jedem Staat, der bereit ist, die Politik einer friedlichen Verständigung zu betreiben, mit Sperren von Anleihen, mit wirtschaftlichen Repressalien, mit Kündigung von Darlehen und so weiter. Wir geben einen erschütternden Einblick die Berichte der polnischen Botschaft in Washington, London, Paris und Brüssel. Im Januar 1939 beginnt dieser Mann seine Hitzkampagne zu verstärken und droht mit allen Maßnahmen vor dem Kongress gegen die autoritären Staaten vorzugehen, außer mit Krieg. Während er dauernd behauptet, dass andere Staaten versuchten, sich in amerikanische Angelegenheiten einzumischen und auf die Aufrechterhaltung der Monroe-Doktrin pocht, beginnt er seit dem März 1939 in innereuropäische Angelegenheiten hineinzureden, die den Präsidenten der Vereinigten Staaten überhaupt nicht angehen. Erstens versteht er diese Probleme nicht und zweitens, selbst wenn er sie verstünde und die geschichtlichen Hergänge begriffe, hätte er ebenso wenig das Recht, sich um den mitteleuropäischen Raum zu bekümmern, wie etwa das deutsche Staat überhaupt ein Recht hat, über die Verhältnisse in einem Staat der USA zu urteilen oder dazu in Stellung zu nehmen.
1 month before the end of the war, Eisenhower issued orders concerning the prisoners. Prison enclosures are to provide no shelter or other comforts. Eisenhower's biographer, who had access to his personal letters, states that he had hoped to eliminate the entire German general staff, a murder of thousands. His hatred was not just of Nazis and Hitler, but of German people. But his mistreatment and murder of Germans was in violation of international law under the Geneva Convention. So in March of 1945, Eisenhower issued another order that German POWs be classified as disarmed enemy forces, which he argued did not fall under Geneva regulations. Soldiers would not be fed, clothed, given water, or medical attention. The Red Cross would be denied access. While the world was hearing about Jewish death camps like Auschwitz, the German DEF camps would go largely unreported. Journalist Peter Worthington of the Ottawan Sun.
It is hard to escape the conclusion that Dwight Eisenhower was a war criminal of epic proportions. His DEF policy killed more Germans in peace than were killed in the European theater.
This policy allowed Eisenhower to continue the camps, even months after the war was over.
For years, we have blamed the 1.7 million missing German POWs on the Russians. Until now, no one dug too deeply. Witnesses and survivors have been interviewed by the author. One Allied officer compared the American camps to Buchenwald. Even though Allied forces had stockpiles of food and medical supplies, German soldiers were left to die. The only command to release prisoners was that of General George Patton's Third Army, who disobeyed Eisenhower and turned prisoners loose to find a way home. General Omar Bradley and J.C.H. Lee ordered release as well, but a SHAEF, or Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, order signed by Eisenhower on May 15 countermanded them. Huddled close together for warmth behind the barbed wire was a most awesome sight. Nearly 100,000 haggard, apathetic, dirty, gaunt, blank-staring men clad in dirty gray uniforms and standing ankle-deep in mud. Water was a major problem, yet only 200 yards away, the River Rhine was running bank full.
When they caught me throwing sea rations over the fence, they threatened me with imprisonment. One captain told me that he would shoot me if he saw me again tossing food to the Germans. Some of the men were really only boys, 13 years of age. Some of the prisoners were old men, drafted by Hitler in his last-ditch stand. I understand that average weight of the prisoners at Andernach was 90 pounds. I have received threats. Nevertheless, this has liberated me, for I may now be heard when I relate the horrible atrocity I witnessed as a prison guard for one of Eich's death camps along the Rhine.
Perhaps Eisenhower's hatred for Germans could be due to his own Jewish blood, a fact that was not known until his time at West Point Academy. This was at a time when West Point was not admitting non-whites, but Eisenhower would be allowed to stay. In the 1915 yearbook, he was later listed as a terrible Swedish Jew, an important and overlooked aspect considering what would later become war crimes against the Germans, an aspect that concerned General Douglas MacArthur enough to protest to his superiors that he did not want Eisenhower on his staff. General George Patton was no different. He was not fond of Jews and more keen to fighting the Soviets. In addition to freeing German POWs, he had been criticized for his harsh treatment of Jews in their detention centers. In a letter dated 4 October 1945, addressed to Lieutenant Colonel Charles R. Caudman, he expressed his sentiments only 3 days before Eisenhower relieved him of command. So far as the Jews are concerned, they do not want to be placed in comfortable buildings. They actually prefer to live as many to a room as possible. They have no conception of sanitation, hygiene, or decency, and are, as you know, the same subhuman types that we saw in the internment camps. The letter also refers to the Soviets and Bolsheviks as degenerate descendants of Genghis Khan. War correspondent Noel Monks once claimed he had heard Patton describe what was then known as shell shock as an invention of the Jews. Patton was not only frustrated having to align with the Soviets, but that Washington was not bothering to pursue the release of thousands of POWs captured by them. Many ended up in gulags for life, if not murdered. The idea that the West could so readily concede so much of Eastern Europe to the Soviets confounded him, and he was often vocal about it, and Eisenhower had enough. The writing was on the wall. Now that victory in Europe was clearly in sight, Patton was no longer needed. Perhaps no one was more aware of his circumstances than Patton himself. Yet another war has come to an end, and with it, my usefulness to the world. In July of 1945, he was appointed military governor of Bavaria, but it ended shortly after he began putting Nazis in authoritative positions, arguing that many had simply been forced to join the party. He once told an American reporter that Nazis were very much like Democrats and Republicans. His appraisal of U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Jewish real estate mogul Henry Morgenthau Jr. was an unpopular one, claiming that Morgenthau was taking Semitic revenge against Germany. This was not well received in the States due to the overwhelming pro-Jewish sentiment in U.S. media, but it was accurate. After all, the plan to demilitarize Germany by removing or destroying their arms and related industries bore no other name than the Morgenthau Plan, named for Henry himself. It was true that the Jews had first waged war once again on the Germans, and Patton seemed to be the only one to speak out about it. It was also true that Morgenthau had called for top German officials to be shot upon capture. Patton did not hold back with his opinions of the Soviets, saying, "We've kicked the hell out of one bastard only to establish a second one, more evil and more dedicated than the first." Patton wanted the war to continue, only this time against and not with the Soviets. These statements led to his release, both as military governor in Bavaria and from command of the U.S. Third Army. He would be reassigned to the 15th Army, operating out of a hotel in Hesse. This unit was solely focused on compiling history of the war. December 9, 1945, Patton embarks on a pheasant hunting trip with Chief of Staff Major General Hobart Gay, chauffeured in a 1938 Model 25 Cadillac by Private First Class Horace Woodring. In a separate vehicle, Technical Sergeant Joseph Scruce, who transported the guns and a hunting dog. The two vehicles were scheduled to meet later at an MP checkpoint. Patton and Gay would visit the Roman ruins at Salzburg and continue to the Autobahn, heading towards Mannheim, where they met with Sergeant Scruce, who now led the envoy to Mannheim. Upon arrival at a train crossing, Scruce managed to cross the tracks, while Patton's car would now have to wait for an oncoming train. After the train passed, Scruce was no longer in sight. On the opposite side of the tracks were two U.S. Army trucks parked on the shoulder. As Patton's car approached, one truck driven by T5 Robert L. Thompson veered across the road, hitting Patton's vehicle. It appeared to be a minor crash, and no one was injured, except for Patton, who was seriously wounded, bleeding from the head, and unable to move. He was taken to the 130th Hospital in Heidelberg, despite the fact that a closer hospital was located in Mannheim. When Patton arrived, he was discovered to have severe dislocation of the vertebrae in his neck, causing severe spinal cord damage. Paralyzed from the neck down. By December 19, General George Patton was dead. Official cause of death? Pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was buried in Luxembourg. For years, most had believed that Patton's death was simply the result of a tragic accident. But in 1974, British writer Frederick Nolan published The Oshawa Project, titled The Algonquin Project in the U.S. In it, a plot is mentioned between President Truman and General Eisenhower to assassinate a problematic American general after the war. The novel features a General Campion, who is based on Patton, a legendary war hero, military governor of Bavaria, and critic of the Soviets. Nolan never claimed that the character was based on Patton, but the possibilities of Patton being murdered were now being discussed. Similar books would follow, but it was the 1993 nonfiction work titled Death, the Murder of General Patton by Stephen Skubic, a former Army counterintelligence agent and advisor on European affairs to multiple U.S. presidents, that would once again reignite the topic. Skubic contends that he became aware of the plot by the Russian People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs back in 1945. Upon notifying his superiors, he was instead sent back to the U.S. Years later, a former OSS special agent, Douglas DeWitt Bazata, spoke of his own involvement in the murder of Patton, claiming that the auto accident was simply the setup for a sniper's bullet, the shot that did not kill Patton, but dislocated his vertebrae. That shot came from Bazata himself.
And he and General Gay went hunting in Germany the day before, and on the way back, there was a plot to kill him with a special air rifle that shot a mushroom-shaped projectile.
Was this Bazata's?
This was Bazata's operation.
So he was laying in wait with this air rifle.
Yeah, and somebody had stolen a deuce and a half from a motor pool, and the deuce and a half ran into the front of Patton's Cadillac limo, caused a minor accident. Patton was, at the precise time, was shot in the back of the head with this thing. It broke his neck, threw him forward to the glass partition between the front and the back seat. Had all kinds of lacerations on his head, and they thought he was dead, but he actually survived that. And General Gay, who was sitting in the back seat with him, didn't even have a bruise on his knees. So it was all contrived through Bazata's operation. Yeah. They take him to past several hospitals to another hospital in Heidelberg, and they put him in some kind of a special neck brace, and the neck brace was not working for him. His vital signs were diminishing. This all happened on December 11th, 1945. His vital signs were diminishing, and the next day the media was there, and there happened to be a British neurosurgeon that happened to be there. Looks at the x-rays, looks at the device on his head, and he says that's the worst thing he can possibly do. Changed it around so it was more effective. In the next few days, his vital signs came back, and I think on December 19th, he had a press conference, and he announced to the media that he was going to go back to...
Patton had a press conference?
He was back. He was sitting up in bed drinking his bourbon and
smoking a cigar.
Giving the nurses a hard time. And so he announced to the media at like 10 o'clock in the morning that he was going to go back to Walter Reed for final recovery and go back into civilian.
Is there footage of that?
Probably.
Yeah.
Well, at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he was dead. No autopsy, no pathology, no toxicology. The medical reports disappeared from the National Archives. The investigation reports have all disappeared. And Bob has really chronicalized everything that happened in this book, and you draw your own conclusion. But the conclusion that you would have to draw just from logic is that Patton was assassinated.
Now, was the operation in the hospital Bazata's? action, or was he done with the air rifle?
The Soviet NKVD had totally infiltrated the OSS.
Yeah.
So it was probably a Soviet-inspired assassination.
And the OSS was a precursor to the CIA.
Yes.
This confession first came at an OSS reunion dinner in D.C., later from Robert K. Wilcox in the book Target Patton. He goes on to explain that it was OSS Chief Major General William Donovan, the founding father of the CIA, who personally gave the order to kill Patton. Bazata believes that Patton was finished off by cyanide after holding a press conference in the hospital. He refers to the man ordered to perform the killing simply as a Polish man. No autopsy, no medical records, few, if any, archives. Patton had hoped to publish his own memoirs, which would likely reveal how Europe was given to the Soviets, the truth about Morgenthau and his policy, Eisenhower's capitulation to international Jewry, the media's Soviet bias, and the deliberate weakening of the U.S. Army. I have been just as furious as you at the compilation of lies which the communist and Semitic elements of our government have leveled against me and practically every other commander. In my opinion, it is a deliberate attempt to alienate the soldier vote from the commanders, because the communists know that soldiers are not communistic, and they fear what 11 million votes would do. Bazata went on to serve in the Reagan administration as Special Assistant to Secretary of the Navy John F. Lehman Jr. For diverse political reasons, many extremely high-ranking persons hated Patton. I know who killed him, because I am the one who was hired to do it. $10,000. General William J. Wild Bill Donovan himself, director of OSS, entrusted me with the mission. I set up the accident. Patton had revealed his plans for after his military career in a letter to Major General James Harbord. It is my present thought that when I finish this job, which will be around the first of the year, I shall resign, not retire, because if I retire, I will still have a gag in my mouth. I should not start a limited counterattack, which would be contrary to my military theories, but should wait until I can start an all-out offensive. In April and May of 1945, Patton had been vocally opposed to the orders given to him to stand down and allow the Red Army to occupy massive stretches of land in Germany, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, when he felt it was the Americans' right to take. We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we're about to replace them with Mongolian savages. Now the horrors of peace, pacifism, and unions will have unlimited sway. I wish I were young enough to fight in the next one. It would be real fun killing Mongols. It is hell to be old and passé and know it. And he most certainly did not hold back with his opinions on German post-war policy. The noise against me is only the means by which the Jews and communists are attempting, and with good success, to implement a further dismemberment of Germany. I think that if I resigned, as I threatened to do yesterday, it would simply discredit me, to no purpose. We promised the Europeans freedom. It would be worse than dishonorable not to see that they have it. This might mean war with the Russians, but what of it? They have no air force, and their gasoline and ammunition supplies are low. I've seen their miserable supply trains, mostly wagons drawn by beaten-up old horses or oxen. I'll say this: the Third Army alone, and with damned few casualties, could lick what is left of the Russians in 6 weeks. You mark my words. Don't ever forget them. Someday we will have to fight them, and it will take 6 years and cost us 6 million lives. Evidently, the virus started by Morgenthau and Baruch of a Semitic revenge against all Germans is still working. Harrison and his associates indicate that they feel German civilians should be removed from houses for the purpose of housing displaced persons. There are 2 errors in this assumption. First, when we remove an individual German, we punish an individual German, while the punishment is not intended for the individual, but for the race. Furthermore, it is against my Anglo-Saxon conscience to remove a person from a house, which is a punishment, without due process of law. Patton would reluctantly have to toss these Germans out of their homes, despite his protests. All of this leading to a tremendous demonization campaign against Patton, one that continues today. But the reality is, if what General Patton said was true, and it appeared to be so, the Third Army and the U.S. could very well have prevented the entire Cold War. $6 million, a number that so many have heard since the end of World War II. 6 million exterminated lives, 6 million Jews. Where did we get this number? Immediately following the war, most experts did not know. In 1979, before a court in Frankfurt, German historian Martin Brosat of the Munich Institute for Contemporary History stated that 6 million was a symbolic number. But is it okay to use such a large number, referring to death, as simply symbolic? Or is accuracy simply not important? In fact, until 1991, when the study titled Dimensions of Genocide explored the topic in great detail, much of the previous estimates were taken at face value. The general public first heard the claim of 6 million during the Nuremberg trials. Wilhelm Hitzel, Austrian party member, and later a member of the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, stated, "Eichmann told me that in the various extermination camps, some 4 million Jews have been killed, while 2 more million perished in other ways." He confirmed this number once again years later in his memoirs. Dieter Wiślewski was the other to use this estimate. He was the one to reintroduce the use of the yellow star to identify Jews in occupied countries. His personal testimony would help prosecute Eichmann. He said that he would leap, laughing into the grave, because the feeling he had 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a source of extraordinary satisfaction. Eichmann stood trial, and many years later was captured by Mossad and brought to Israel, where he was later hanged on the 31st of May, 1962. In his trial, he was asked whether the Jews he had deported were aware of what awaited them. He replied,
Draußen, die haben das lange nicht gewusst. Ich selber wusste es ja auch nicht, ob diese Transporte zum Beispiel, wenn sie ins Generalgouvernement...
The people out there did not know that for a long time. I myself didn't know either whether these transports, for instance, if they went into the general government, occupied Poland, then I knew that nothing happened to them as long as Glavochnik was not working there. If they went to Auschwitz, it is very clear that the majority was deployed for labor there. I was kept in the dark as well, how many or who would be killed, but I did not worry about that either because that was not my area of responsibility. It cannot be denied, though, that I knew about the things due to the service trips I was ordered to make to the East.
Please stick to the subject.
Eichmann alluded to the fact that much of what he learned about the Holocaust, he learned in the book, The Final Solution, by Gerald Reitlinger. But as noted before, it was Russian novelist Ilya Ehrenberg that mentioned the death toll of 6 million in 1944. In the December 22nd issue of Soviet War News, the same paper would make the same claim twice more in 1945. So how was it that Ehrenberg could know this total, this astounding death total, before any Allied soldiers had even stepped onto German soil? The question gets even more complicated when we realize that the specific number of 6 million is mentioned even sooner than that. The Youngstown Vindicator in 1944 anticipated Ehrenberg's work and mentioned the number of 6 million months before Ehrenberg. Another in the same year came from Rabbi Chaim Michael Dov Weissmandl in a letter dated May of 1944. He had corresponded with Churchill, Roosevelt, and Pope Pius VII, a claim of 6 million Jews murdered, tens of thousands daily. But the claim becomes even more dubious with the fact that Weissmandl had been hiding in a cave in Poland and would have had no idea how many casualties there really were. But this is still not even the first time we see the total of 6 million in print. May 15, 1943, the Adelaide Advertiser, Appeal on Behalf of the Jews. May 14, 1943, the Canadian Jewish Review, Dr. Harry J. Stern. March 20, 1943, the Cumberland Evening Times. March 10, 1943, the New York Times, page 12. February 1943, Reader's Digest, which at the time had the largest circulation in the world, mentions that the Jews will have been reduced from a minority to a phantom. And the number once again is the mythical 6 million, an astounding number considering that the main chambers at Auschwitz had not yet been completed. The Reader's Digest article had not been written by a war correspondent with the inside track on European intelligence, but was written by a Jewish Hollywood scriptwriter, Ben Hecht, known for having written the 1927 film Underworld from Paramount Pictures. The importance of this article and its sphere of influence cannot be overstated. It was largely because of this Hollywood storyteller that the world would learn of the killing of a supposed 6 million Jews even before it happened. December 13, 1942. New York Times, in an article on page 21 titled, Tardy War Report Held Aid to Faith, a collection of New York rabbis call the slaughter of 2 million Jews a Holocaust without parallel. A week later, the New York Times would add another 5 million were in danger. June 24, 1940. The Palm Beach Post prints a statement from Nahum Goldman. 6 million Jews in Europe are doomed to destruction. A day before the French would begin the surrender to Germany, negotiated just a few days before that. Once again, it would appear that Goldman had advanced knowledge of this event. Even more unusual, as it was the continuation of the war, not an agreement with Hitler. That was the supposed reason for the Holocaust to begin with. January 15, 1939. The New York Times publishes an article featuring a statement from Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, claiming that it is impossible to evacuate 6 million Jews. In 1936, the Peel Commission convened to address unrest in Palestine and to discuss partition against the will of the Arabs, who had already been given a promise of Palestine from the British, now wanting to give large portions of land to Zionist delegates. The London Times reported on the testimony of Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who referred to 6 million unwanted unfortunates in Europe. September 8, 1935. The New York Times, on page 26, publishes the article, Congress Defends Polish Jews, where we see yet again the mention of 6 million Jews being represented at the First World Conference of the Federation of Polish Jews. March 27, 1933. Page 9 of the New York Times, in an article titled, Aldermen Vote, Hitler Protest, comes another appeal for funding for the relief and reconstructive work in Eastern Europe, where 6 million Jews are involved. In fact, there are numerous mentions of 6 million Jews going even further back. Where did this number come from? And why is it now solely attributed to Hitler, when it appeared to be an issue well before the war? One of the earliest references comes from the Jewish Herald and Record of Christian Effort for the Spiritual Good of God's Ancient People. This was a Christian publication with the aim of converting Jews to Christianity. The year, 1850. And on page 216 of Volume 5, the number 6 million is listed as a total of the world's Jews. Not 6 million in Europe, 6 million worldwide. In 1866, the Latter-day Saints Millennial Star cites the same number, 6 million worldwide. The New York Times, once again, on September 12, 1869, on page 8, under the Sunday Notes section, speaks of 6 million Israelites, nearly half of whom live in Europe. Most were in Russia. This would mean that in order for the Holocaust numbers to be true, the estimate would need to have doubled by the Second World War, or that the numbers weren't true. The same New York Times letter on October 31st, under the headline of Religious Intelligence, confirms a total of 6 million Jews, not in Europe, but around the world. The New York Times offers more statistics 20 years later, on February 10, 1889, in the article, How Many Jews Are There? Yet instead of the new numbers, the same 6 million figure appears. By this time, Tsar Alexander II of Russia had been assassinated, by Jewish Bolsheviks, which led to many of the pogroms against the Jews, a perspective that is rarely discussed in university curriculum. The New York Times was once again there to report in 1882. Russian Jewish Horrors, a 9-month record of rapine, murder, and outrage. On April 22nd, the article Russia and the Jews speaks of the annihilation of the Jewish people. Tsar Alexander III had become tired of the Jewish violence, revolution, instigation, and overrepresentation of Russian financial affairs. Many towns expelled their Jews, leading to the beginning of a Jewish mass migration. By 1891, the New York Times was in full swing with the idea of a persecuted 6 million, many of them front-page articles. 15 of these articles penned by American journalist Harold Frederick, now attributing the 6 million figure to Europe's total of Jews. As more Jews fled Russia, they discovered that most other countries didn't seem to want them either. By 1897, world Jewry was beginning to see Zionism as an answer to this and a host of other issues. Theodor Herzl had released Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which media used to promote the idea of emigration to Palestine. And one of the most prominent mouthpieces for the American Jews, Rabbi Stephen Wise, said in June of 1900, "There are 6 million living, bleeding, suffering arguments in favor of Zionism." April 19, 1903, the New York Times reports on anti-Jewish pogroms in Kishinev, reported as a massacre and even a Holocaust, and asserts that 5 million are branded as perilous pests which must slowly be annihilated. The very next month, the New York Times publishes How This Country Should Regard Russia, featuring comments from composer Oscar Strauss of the famed musical dynasty. Again, the term Holocaust is used and begins to seep into the American lexicon. November 10, 1905, the New York Times features Jewish Lafayette Lodge and Freemason and president of the B'nai B'rith, president of the Hebrew Orphans Home in Georgia, president of the Board of Children's Guardians in Washington, Simon Wolf, asking the question how long the Russian Holocaust was to continue. This was during a time when the 1905 putsch in Russia had failed. Days later, on the 13th of November, page 1 of the New York Times, the news is now that Jews are being exterminated as part of a Holocaust, and the Russian Orthodox Church is forcing Jews be either converted or exterminated. October 20, 1904, A Land for Jews in Africa by the New York Times appears just before the First World War was about to begin, featuring another playwright, Jewish Zionist author Israel Zangwill, brother of author Louis Zangwill, this time featuring an often discussed alternative to Palestine and using South Africa as a destination that was considered by Nazi Germany, and that many years later would fall prey to severe racial violence. Like so many other articles, the number 6 million in Russia depicts a Holocaust. Not the Holocaust of Russian and Ukrainian Christians of the Holodomor, a media Holocaust. A story told not by war reporters, but by playwrights, propagandists, and filmmakers, many whom would flock to a new Babylon, Hollywood. January 29, 1905, as Russia is in disarray, the New York Times publishes End of Zionism, Maybe, depicting a sermon by Reverend Dr. M.H. Harris, who references Russia's 6 million Jews, and that a free Russia could mean the end of Zionism. After the first failed Russian Revolution, the New York Times continued to report on a 6 million Jews being slaughtered. But how could any of this have been true at the time? The article on November 1st, 1905, claims that the chief procurator of the Holy Synod, Konstantin Petrovich Pobyedonoscev, was responsible for 6 million Russian Jews to be expelled, a total that many claimed was the total number of Jews in the entire world. All reported as being expelled by one man, and not during the Second World War, but from the years of 1890 to 1902. This couldn't possibly be true, but even if it were, It would mean that decades later, when Hitler took power, there would have been no Jews left. March 25, 1906. The Central Jewish Relief League of Germany hear the Holocaust narrative from a publicist, Dr. Paul Nathan. Nathan was an important figure in establishing a school system in Palestine. Nathan contributed to the defense of numerous Jews accused of blood libel during the ghastly Tisha Essler ritual murder trial. The Hungarian village had been at the center of numerous blood libel accusations. Blood libel is the act of murdering young Christian boys in order to use their blood for ritualistic purposes, a charge that Christians have contended with Jews since the medieval period. In this case, it was the disappearance of Esther Solomosi, who was found beheaded. The accused were acquitted, but many locals believed it was thanks to the influence of powerful Jews like Nathan. In this meeting, Nathan was warning that the Russian government's solution to the Jewish question was extermination. The New York Times maintains this 6 million total through 1910, now attributing the number to Russia's total number of Jews and not all of Europe. Now referencing the systematic, relentless, quiet grinding down of a people of more than 6 million souls. October 31st, 1911. Still again, the New York Times, 6 million Jews of now only Russia are singled out for systematic oppression. December 10, 1911, a full-page article titled Condition of Jews in Russia speaks on the economically exhausted 6 million Jews. All of these instances came before not only Hitler and the Nazi regime, but before even the First World War. In the American Jewish Yearbook, 1911-1912 calls the Russian co-religionists deplorable and speaks of a plan to expel or exterminate 6 million of its people. By the time of the First World War, the New York Times had run with the story of 6 million, now this time in a war zone. The usual appeal for financial aid came from journalist, nonfiction writer, and known CIA asset C.L. Sulzberger, as well as treasurer of the American Jewish Relief Fund, German Jewish banker Felix Warburg. January 14, 1915. The New York Times prints that more than 6 million Jews are in the very heart of the war zone. February 28, 1916. Again, the New York Times, in an article that mentions a gift of $25,000 to the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Society of America from Jewish banker Jacob Schiff, the man who held a lion's share of responsibility for helping to start the First World War. Yet again, the notion of 6 million Jews appears. A couple years later, near the end of the war, on October 18, 1918, the title states that $1 billion would be needed to rebuild Jewry and its 6 million souls, all while Jewish Bolsheviks were slaughtering and starving millions and violently murdering the Russian Tsar and his family. It's easy to see how public opinion was shaped regarding this topic. The number seems to be everywhere you look. The American Jewish Committee published The Jews in the Eastern War Zone in 1916. 25,000 copies were sent out to various U.S. politicians and public influencers. One of these, President Woodrow Wilson, members of his cabinet and Congress, as well as U.S. media. This text would be the basis for more New York Times and other media outlet stories, which would shape the narrative over the next few years. On page 12, Russia is accused of creating a campaign to exterminate the Jews, and later on page 19, the total 6 million is seen. The next page claiming that 6 million are all in Russia. In fact, numerous mentions of this mythical number appear throughout the text. A few years later, the American Hebrew prints, "The Crucifixion of the Jews Must Stop" in October of 1919. Like so many times before, the battle cry of 6 million rings out. Although these battle cries will not tell you that the Tsarist regime fought against Germany and Austria. So was this really about liberation? Democracy? What much of this sensationalism appeared to boil down to was fundraising, and lots of it. The truth was that Russia was in tatters due to the Jewish-led Bolshevik Revolution. The Red Army was met with resistance from the White Russians, or Tsarist loyalists. Many ethnic Jews became prominent leaders of the Red Army, which did much of the persecution, and were not at all the helpless victims of Orthodox persecution. Russia was not in the position to persecute, and most certainly not to the tune of 6 million. This was the real reason for the anti-Jewish sentiment, and not some nebulous idea of anti-Semitism, which so many historians are quick to claim. On September 8, 1919, the New York Times publishes the article, "Ukrainian Jews Aim to Stop Pogroms," stating that 127,000 Jews had been murdered and that 6 million were in peril. Only now, the 6 million are in Ukraine and Poland. December 20, 1922, the New York Times publishes South Russian Jews Raise Strong Army, stating that Jews were organizing and fighting back against their persecutors. But who were the persecutors? Russians? Ukrainians? Germans? Or the Polish? By 1920, Jews were beginning to understand that communist Russia was destined to fail. With it would come backlash against the Jews, who many understood had brought the revolution to Europe in the first place. The New York Times publishes an article from the Chicago Tribune titled, "Begs America Save 6 Million in Russia." At the time, the Jews in Russia were reported to be raising an army, but once again would be needing financial support. The Chicago Tribune had printed this article, yet with another headline, suggesting that they too were fleeing the Red Army, when in fact the article notes they feared the Reds being defeated. After the First World War, the New York Times was the biggest promoter of this fundraising machine, led by Jewish bankster Felix Warburg. A November 12, 1919 article reveals that $30 million had already been spent on Jewish aid. April 21, 1920, the New York Times lowers the number to 5 million Jews starving or suffering from typhus, which many Jews did die from during both wars. The fundraising goal for New York City alone, $7,500,000. May 1, 1920. A full-page ad appears on page 8 of the New York Times, raising funds for 6 million lives, led by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. 2 days later, another fundraising ad, asking for thousands to prevent this catastrophe the world had yet to actually see. Ad after ad, appeal after appeal, the lives of 6 million unarmed souls raising billions over decades by some of the wealthiest and most influential Jews: Nathan Strauss, Rabbi Stephen Wise, Max Warburg, Jonas Mackenzie of Levi Strauss, Louis Brandeis, and Henry Morgenthau. A few years later in 1926, another ad in the New York Times states the familiar 6 million total, only now attributing this total to all of Europe. The total sum requested? $6 million. December 4, 1926, the New York Times reveals that a sum of $62 million had been distributed, but that much more was needed. It also mentions a total of $33 million, raised by the Literary Digest for a Child Feeding Fund. But even after almost 15 years of continual fundraising, 6 million were somehow still dying in Europe. 1931, the Montreal Gazette prints another report from Rabbi Wise asking for $2.5 million. Hundreds of millions of dollars from 1914 to 1934. Even the New York Times in 1927 had accused the JDC of misappropriating funds and manipulating them for their own needs. As much as 40% of the funds had disappeared, according to the article. No formal investigation occurred. In fact, much of this aid went to general improvements, electrification of village, irrigation, water supply, and other projects. According to J.C. Hyman, in 25 years of American aid to Jews overseas, published in 1935, these funds were likely also supporting Jewish militias in their assistance to the Red Army, much like how Schiff had funded Trotsky's endeavors. Over 240 examples of this media blitz are listed in the book 6 Million Open Gates. Time after time, more and more money sent abroad to save what seems to be a perpetual 6 million by raising billions of dollars, most all occurring years before Hitler ever came into power. The international funds that have been raised for this cause since the mid-1800s resembles more of an industry than a relief program. Ever since the world's population of Jewry reached 6 million, the number has been used to report on stories attributing to their persecution of that number over and over. A large portion of this reporting came almost immediately after the Jewish Bolshevik assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. The world would become familiar with this total. So if 6 million were truly dead, where are they? Where were they killed? And when? How is it that so much of the media world could agree on such a number, especially years before it was even supposed to happen? And why 6 million? Why not less? Or even more? If 6 million is simply a symbolic number, then what does it symbolize? In the Aleph Bet, Jewish thought revealed through the Hebrew letters, Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg explains the letter Vav equals 6. The number 6 also appears in the Zohar, which reads, He created 6, which Ginsburg equates to 6 days of creation and the 6 directions of space, cosmic completion, symbolized in the 6-pointed star, or Seal of Solomon. In Kabbalistic literature, 6 million represents the number of perfect souls, times 10, 10 being the number of Sephirah. This is based upon an ancient sexagesimal mathematical system used by Jewish scribes during their time in Babylon, likely taken from the earlier Sumerians. The Seal of Solomon represents 3 separate multiplications of 10 by the 3 points of the sacred triangle, one pointing downward to represent the feminine and water, upward representing the masculine and fire. The Seal of Solomon represents the active and passive principles of creation. In the Zohar, the Hebrew letter Yod and the letter A make up the first 2 letters of the divine tetragrammaton, Yahweh. Yah being the name of the Canaanite deity, the number 6 is represented in the tetragrammaton by the letter W, or Vav. The use of gematria also factors in when reading Kabbalistic text, an analysis that operates by assigning numerical values to text, allowing the reader to arrive at various conclusions and interpretations. It is this method being applied to the 3rd book of Torah, the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 10. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land. Unto all the inhabitants thereof it shall be a jubilee unto you. And ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. The Hebrew phrase for ye shall return, tashuvu, appears to be spelled incorrectly, lacking the letter vav, signifying 6. Perhaps an implication that the Jewish people shall return, minus 6? The Freemasonic Grand Wizard Albert Pike, in his 1871 work Morals and Dogma, give us more detail as to the importance of Vav in completing spells of deception. Wisdom is the logos that creates. By means of its utterance, the letter Yod, it creates the world's first in the divine intellect as an idea, which invested with form became the fabricated world, the universe of material reality. Yod receives light from Vav, Yod and He, 2 letters of the ineffable name of the manifested deity, represents the male and female, the active and passive in equilibrium, and the Vav completes the Trinity and the trilateral name, the divine triangle, with which the repetition of He becomes the tetragrammaton, the name of God, Yahweh, Yehovah. In the year 1948, we saw the Jewish return to Israel, the Hebrew calendar 5708, the year predicted by the incomplete word Tashuvu. And perhaps this is why we remember the number so well, its mystical repetition. Anywhere from 25 to 50 million were killed by Bolsheviks in Russia, tens of millions killed after World War II. 35 to 40 million killed in China, and over 1 million in the Armenian genocide. But it is the 6 million figure, and not the others, that remain in the forefront of our collective memory. True numbers forgotten, in exchange for a symbolic one, symbolizing not a tragedy, but a perfect creation, part of Tikkun Olam, the Talmudic repairing of perfecting the world, from those who declare themselves chosen, according to Sefer Zohar. It's important to note that much of Kabbalah is oral tradition. Kabbalah itself refers to the hearing or reception. The deepest secrets never make it to written word, but only to the ear of an understanding recipient. From Protocol 5 of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Moreover, the art of directing masses and individuals by means of cleverly manipulated theory and verbiage, by regulations of life in common and all sorts of other quirks, in all which the Goyim understand nothing, belongs likewise to the specialists of our administrative, brain-reared on analysis observation, on delicacies of fine calculation. In this species of skill, we have no rivals, any more than we have either in the drawing up of plans of political actions and solidarity. The word Holocaust means burnt offering or fiery sacrifice, similar to the way children were offered up to the god Moloch, depicted here in Chicago during a celebration in 1933 at Chicago's Soldier Field, organized by the Zionist Organization of America, where one of the key speakers was Chaim Weizmann himself. A passing through the fire as described in Talmudic text. But was this even possible to have burned millions of bodies, especially with fuel and a host of other shortages Germany was experiencing at the end of the war? Is it the ancient god of Moloch that gives rise to the tale of 6 million cremated bodies, the way Solomon had allowed babies to burn? Former conservative Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. They have fabricated a legend under the name of Massacre of the Jews, and they hold it higher than God himself, religion itself, and the prophets themselves. The story of 6 million has ruined the lives of many who dared question its validity. The number of perfect souls times 10, the letter 6, the perfect letter and number of completion, multiplied by the 10 Sephirot, a hex based on traditions of ancient Kabbalah. Although many scholars disagree, the Zohar, a 13th century work on Kabbalah, is usually attributed to Tanaic mystic Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai, who taught during the 2nd century in Judea, shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. He is written of in Baraita Midrash and Babylonian Gemara, including Jerusalem Talmud, which predates even the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai taught, "Kill the best of the heathens in time of war. Crush the brain of the best of serpents. The most worthy of women indulges in witchcraft. Happy is he who does the will of the omnipresent." Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai taught, "Kill even the good among the Gentiles." It's important to understand the ideas of Zohar, Talmud, and Kabbalah, discussed in episodes 1 and 2, to see the aim of the ancient Jewish mystic, the aim of the left-hand path, destruction, to balance birth and renewal. Israel itself must pass through a fire, if only symbolic. The demonic powers should be given a portion, occupying and assuaging them, so that they will not disturb Israel's intimacy with God. The evil impulse is good, and without the evil impulse, Israel cannot prevail in the world. The Kabbalah is indeed of the essence of Freemasonry. The whole basis of our theory is the Kabbalah, the embrace of Babylonian mysticism and rejection of the laws of Moses followed the Israelites out of Egypt. Without this magical number of 6 million, no more, no less, which has hypnotized the masses, the Holocaust narrative begins to show its holes, much like the ancient claims that the Jewish Talmud has made over so many years. 4 billion Jews were murdered by the Romans in the city of Bethar. 16 million Jewish children were wrapped in scrolls and burnt alive by the Romans. March 22nd, 1916, page 7 of the Daily Telegraph publishes the article titled Atrocities in Serbia, accusing Austria and Bulgaria of massacres of entire villages being either stabbed or suffocated by means of asphyxiating gas, thousands allegedly suffocated. Today, most historians agree that this was not true, but it is one of the first times we hear of such a crime as gassing citizens. We see a similar story from the Daily Telegraph, June 25, 1945, on page 5, only this time, 700,000 Polish Jews being slaughtered by the Germans, traveling gas chambers the supposed means. Disbelieving this story could result in a prison term up to 10 years in Germany, Russia, and Israel. In Italy, Switzerland, and Poland, 3 years. The only event of its kind in history, prevented from criminal investigation. We saw a similar narrative presented in 1991 by the Jewish press claiming gas chambers for Jews were in Iraqi possession. This was echoed by the Simon Wiesenthal periodical Response. This also proved to be untrue. But what of the concentration camps in Europe, where millions were said to be killed?
Here at Auschwitz railway station, until at least 1943, most persons destined for the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp made their first stop.
In the past 10 years, we have visited most of the still existing concentration camps in Europe, including Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen, and Neuengamme. We have gathered and studied the official information brochures and archives in the museums of these camps. We have interviewed cremation experts, chemists, engineers, and some survivors of these camps. Dr. Frederick Tobin of the Adelaide-based Adelaide Institute has been studying the so-called Jewish Holocaust for more than 30 years. In April 1997, Dr. Tobin travelled to Poland to visit the most notorious of all World War II concentration camps, Auschwitz. Eyewitness testimonies, books, and movies, ignoring the physical evidence, have all added to the legend of this most infamous camp. We say legend because the stories told by the books, movies, and eyewitnesses have all been based on cruel wartime propaganda.
Concentration camps were first used by the British in Africa, by Irish-born Field Marshal Lord Kitchener during the Boer War in the 1890s, capturing and imprisoning women and children of the Boers, leading to the deaths of thousands of women and tens of thousands of children who died of malnutrition and disease. This idea had been implemented by the British after their observation of the Imperial Spanish troops' suppression of revolts in Cuba. One of those observers, Winston Churchill. General Arsenio Martinez Campos constructed the idea, but feared in the end that the results could be horrific. I cannot, as the representative of a civilized nation, be the first to give the example of cruelty and intransigence. Another general, a Bavarian named Valeriano Wehner, would be the first one willing to carry it out. Poland built the first 2 European concentration camps after the Treaty of Versailles and imprisoned 16,000 Germans. Many more camps sprang up over the next decades, housing thousands of Germans and Ukrainians. 5,500 Germans murdered in 1939 by Polish militia, which prompted Hitler to respond and France and England to declare war on Germany. It was at this point that Jews would be detained and put into camps. Today, any Jew who fled Europe and dwelt in a country occupied or controlled by the Nazi regime is considered a Holocaust survivor. Those Jews who suffered inside of Russian gulags during the same period are not. But what Holocaust did they survive? Did Hitler ever truly call for the extermination of Jews? Upon Germany's defeat in 1945, over 3,000 tons of written material was confiscated by the Allied forces. But even with the overwhelming amount of material, not one order was found pertaining to the killing of Jews. The only evidence presented at the Nuremberg trials were the alleged Wannsee protocols, named for the suburb of Berlin, where the claim that Nazi officials under Reinhard Heydrich met to discuss the final solution to the Jewish question. The prosecution claimed that a plan was discussed to eliminate as many Jews as humanly possible. The copies of these documents are written in poor grammatical German and lacked official stamps and marks that should have been easy to forge, considering the notion that all documents, typewriters, letterheads had been seized. No official Nazi plans have ever been discovered. For an order of such a massive scale to have only been passed from officer to officer and division to division would have been logistically impossible. So what did happen at Auschwitz, Dachau, and the other camps? These pictures clearly depict camp labor, but very few guards, if any. Here is a schedule of a normal workday. Prisoners were made to work hard, and sabotage could result in a death penalty. According to the information brochure at Auschwitz, prisoners received 1,300 to 1,700 calories per day. This was more than most German citizens were living on at the time. Towards the end of the war, many did suffer malnourishment due to lack of German supplies, but the camp did house a vegetable garden. This photo is taken during the liberation of Dachau. None of the prisoners appear emaciated or starved.
Fleas and lice spread sickness like wildfire throughout the camp, and by the end of the war the Germans had registered the deaths of 74,000 prisoners from typhus. Around 800 meters towards the back of the camp is a very large building the inmates called the sauna. This building also housed dozens of gas chambers designed to save the lives of the prisoners. All prisoners arriving in Birkenau were first taken to the sauna building, where they had their hair cut, they were showered and registered, checked by a prison doctor and given a prison uniform. Sick prisoners were immediately sent to the camp hospital. Their clothes were then put into one of the many fumigation units and cleansed. These units, much like the ones in Dachau, were obviously carefully designed by engineers and built to typical German perfection. Most chambers had metal doors with multiple locks and piping to carry the pesticides in and out of the chambers without danger to the workers. Not only clothing was cleansed here, but also bedding and mattresses. Although most units in the sauna used hot air to fumigate clothing and mattresses, some units in other buildings used Cyclone B. It is evident by these scenes that the Germans went to a lot of trouble to ensure the health and safety of the prisoners working here. Had the Germans not installed these massive fumigation units, the death toll in the camp could have gone into the hundreds of thousands. As in Dachau, these chambers were never used to harm humans, but to save lives.
Hydrocyanic acid, or Zyklon B, has been used well before the First World War as a fumigant and pesticide. It is often used to rid buildings of vermin, lice, and fleas. It is extremely flammable and liquefies when it comes into contact with concrete or metal, leaving a blue coloring known as Prussian blue. After the fumigation process is complete, the spaces must be aired out for 10 hours minimum, and special suits must be worn to handle it. A gas mask can only be used briefly. These types of outfits were not readily available at Auschwitz, making it impossible to handle the bodies, especially at such a rapid rate, as is claimed.
Well, in this facility we've got the most modern crematorium ovens that exist. Our ovens, well, they burn at about 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius on a mixture of natural gas and oxygen. The average corpse, well, it takes about 1.5 to 2 hours to burn. That's completely, but that depends on its state as well. If it's been stored in very cold or even frozen conditions, this can actually take an hour longer to burn. And even then, the bones don't completely burn to ash. They've got to be crushed in a machine down to a fine gritty mixture, and this process takes about 10 to 15 minutes. No, crematoriums don't give off smoke, and we don't need chimneys. Even when we still use diesel to drive the ovens, they never gave off smoke. So if you see smoke, it's not from the corpses, but it could be from the fuel that's burning but it's definitely not from the corpses. Well, what about coke? Coke is coal with all the volatile fuel taken out of it. Coke is difficult to get burning, and it's not an effective fuel for crematorians. If it gets wet or even damp, it won't burn at all. Our retorts are not designed to burn multiple bodies, not at the one time, but if they were, it would definitely lengthen the time of the cremation quite considerably, because the heat wouldn't be able to circulate around the bodies. It's practically impossible to burn large numbers of bodies to ash in pits. Just pouring fuel over a pile of bodies wouldn't work, because no air gets down to the fire. Just as a barbecue, if you do not have the air getting to the fire goes out. But even in house fires and aeroplane crashes, people don't burn to ash. They're only badly charred. What about burning corpses on pyres? Well, in India, it takes at least 3 to 4 hours to burn a body and around half a tonne of dried wood. As for burning 2,000 corpses on wooden pyres, well, you'd need around 1,000 tonnes of dried wood every day. It'd be impossible. And even then, the large bones never burn to ash. You'd still have to crush them.
These camps were located in wet areas that would have struggled to keep up with the massive fuel demand required to burn so many bodies. Many people were sick and died of typhus, and burying them beneath the ground could contaminate the water supply. This would explain the cremations, which brought in fuel, or coke, an inefficient fuel that can easily get wet and leaves nearly 10% of its own weight in ash. A human body, nearly 1 kilogram of ash. At Birkenau in 1943, 641.5 tons of coke were delivered, according to camp records, over 8 months. This would require numerous small trips to deliver, as the wetlands offered no place to store it. This would equal enough to cremate about 16 bodies a day. Only 31.1 tons were delivered to the main camp that same year, enough to cremate only 2 bodies per day. Thousands per day just simply cannot happen. So how could the Germans have disposed so many bodies and crushed their bones to dust?
We did this demonstration because we wanted to put the eyewitness testimony to the test, something those promoting the Holocaust have never done. So we asked a pyrotechnics expert to dig a small pit and burn 3 telephone books in it, following the methods supposedly used by the Nazis for burning dead bodies. This experiment was carried out not in the marshy wetlands around Auschwitz, but in a dry, sandy Sydney park in the middle of summer. We know that telephone books are compacted dry paper and do not burn particularly well, but if you can prove that human bodies, which are made up of around 75% water, burn faster, better, or more easily than paper, please contact us. Eyewitnesses from Auschwitz report that a mixture of motor oil and methanol was poured over about 2,000 bodies in large pits. Our pit was very much smaller, and we had no methanol, so we made up a mixture of methylated spirits, kerosene and lamp oil, and poured the proportional equivalent of 300 litres over the telephone books. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we lit the fire. Despite the extra fuel, our books were very reluctant to burn, and after only 10 minutes, the fire slowly died down and went out. Undaunted and wanting to give the official story every possible chance, we poured some more flammable fluid over the books. this time the proportional equivalent of 1,000 litres. And this time the flames took off. Crackling and burning, we had now poured the equivalent of 1,300 litres of flammable material onto the books, something that would have been impossible to do every day in Auschwitz. They just never had that amount of fuel available. "20 minutes passed. Mr. Rosenblum had stated that in 20 minutes thousands of dead bodies had been reduced to ash. But in our experiment, the fire had not even burnt through a third of the top telephone book. You will notice in the camera close-ups that there is even sufficient space around the books for air to circulate easily. But even that was not enough to partly destroy one telephone book. You are watching the proof that burning thousands of human bodies in pits sounds very dramatic, but is practically impossible, especially if the bodies had been frozen or it was snowing or raining as it does more than half the year in Auschwitz. After 40 minutes, our fire had gone out again, and our pyrotechnics expert was able to pull the unburnt telephone books out of the pit again. We did not continue with our efforts because we believe our point had been made.
Not one case of death by poison gas was found. Most deaths in concentration camps were caused not by starvation nor maltreatment, but by typhus.
The alleged gas chamber in Dachau, shown to thousands of visitors per year, is right next door to the cremation ovens. It looks like we have all been told a gas chamber should look, with shower heads and peepholes in the door, etc. It once had a small plaque in it on the floor next to the entrance, where it was written, "Built by the Americans after the war." This plaque has been replaced by a larger sign which clearly states in 5 languages, it was never used as a gas chamber. So it's just a Hollywood horror. The only chamber still undestroyed is in the Auschwitz main camp, but it too is a comedy of errors. Whereas the prisoners had a swimming pool next to their barracks, the Germans supposedly built this gas chamber only 20 paces from their SS restaurant and hospital. According to the Polish tour guides, the only method of getting the poisonous gas out of this large chamber was to open 2 flimsy, unsealed doors and let the wind blow hundreds of cubic meters of poisonous gas out onto the street. The only evidence we could find on the inside of the chamber was evidence of incompetence. The roof holes have, once again, been crudely smashed through the concrete. Fixtures that probably belong to toilets have been removed, but proving this alleged gas chamber once had a toilet. And then there is the door, of flimsy wooden construction with a window, and the locking device on the inside, a door that could easily be kicked out. The tinge of blue you may see here comes from the flashed photos and not from any staining from Cyclone B on the walls, because there isn't any. Back up on the roof, Dr. Tobin points out the crematorium chimney, a chimney that is not found on any Allied aerial photos at the time. But we believe it was added later by the Russians. But whoever added it did not bother even attaching it to the building.
There are many features to Auschwitz that you may not see on a guided tour, but are available, such as the swimming pool, which played host to swimming competitions for the prisoners, a post office with deliveries available for prisoners twice a week, a camp library, and upstairs, a brothel, all available for prisoners, a theater for play and musical performances, including a camp orchestra, camp hospital, and prisoner football field, featuring weekly sporting events, a courtroom, which would seem unusual if everyone here were receiving a certain death penalty. The camp even featured a photography studio, run by guards and staffed by prisoners. What many of these photos depict are a far cry from the Hollywood version, fit, healthy prisoners, and by the time the Soviets arrived, not at all emaciated and scrambling for food. Prisoners here appear to be well clothed, with coats and hats, not freezing to death as usually claimed. Hard labor and disease was most certainly present, but little to no evidence of torture and mass murder. 20,000 allegedly shot at the Black Wall, but no evidence of bullet penetration. The International Red Cross had been stationed in many of these camps during the war, a fact that historians tend not to mention. This was upon order of the German High Command, who had wanted to reduce casualties. These reports show that most camps were clean, well-run, and had schools, post offices, and even banks, as well as their own currency. What they did not report: gas chambers. This was confirmed in 1989 during a Canadian civil suit, but in 1997, the Red Cross would change their story and apologize, claiming that these amenities in the camps were constructed as trickery. Since the end of the Second World War, any questioning of the Holocaust and their faulty details has been considered taboo, if not a crime itself. Dr. Frederick Tobin is one of these who dared to challenge this narrative. His film, titled Judea Declares War on Germany, was a crime in Australia, and he stood before the Australian Human Rights Commission to defend his views. During this commission, he was told, "The truth is no defense." This truth earned him close to a year in jail in Germany. Professor Robert Forrison was another revisionist who also spoke out. He was assaulted nearly a dozen times by Holocaust enforcers, having his jaw broken and left for dead. Thies Christofferson, attacked with acid for his brochure Die Bauernschaft, Farming Community, which was seized in 1994. His experience with the Wehrmacht led him to appear in 2 videos claiming that prisoners in Auschwitz were fortunate and treated well. Judge Wilhelm Stoglik, a finance court judge in Hamburg who had been stationed near Auschwitz, had his pension cut and was stripped of his doctorate degree after publishing The Auschwitz Myth, Legend or Reality. Joseph Ginsburg, author, historian, Jew, and camp detainee, testified that there was no Jewish extermination and that Jews were given special diets and medical treatment. He testified that Auschwitz had no gas chambers, just as Marika Frank Adams and Dr. Benedict Kofsky had done, all Jewish witnesses. Berg was beaten and denied burial at a cemetery for Jews in Munich. Arthur Butz, the namesake for the Butz algorithm, published Hoax of the 20th Century, the case against the presumed extermination of European Jewry, has been hounded by the ADL for decades. His book was removed from Amazon.com after Robert Rosette from the Yad Vashem Holocaust Center wrote personally to CEO Jeff Bezos. Haviv Scheiber was a Polish Jew and former Israeli citizen who was put into exile for his deep criticism for the way he depicted many Jews and the Jewish state as a Moloch or false god to which Jews would sacrifice even their own kind. Francois Duprat, a founding member of the Front National Party in France, was murdered for his publishing of the book titled Did 6 Million Really Die? He was killed in a car bomb explosion, injuring his wife as well. A group simply known as the Jewish Revolutionary Group claimed the killing. The police investigation was inconclusive. Ditlev Felderer was one of the first researchers to explore the physical evidence at Auschwitz. He enlightened many to the existence of the Auschwitz pool and openly questioned the validity of Anne Frank's diary.
Yes, but I mean, apart from that, what evidence can you articulate which pertains actually to the book itself? What can you relate to us which would lead us to believe that it is not authentic?
Well, the handwriting is the major thing. It's very obvious that the handwriting cannot belong to the same person when you look at them. This can be observed, and also by, this was later on, I did write about it in my booklet, that investigations should be made. We have today the means to investigate these matters, and the investigation should be made. And as you perhaps know, this was later done, and it was found out that certain parts of it, or certain
details of it were written in a ballpoint pen, which were not in existence commonly at that time. So here they did what I had asked for doing, but there are many other things. The very introduction of Anne Frank, where she mentions the way a house was built and so forth. Now, to me, it was very obvious that a young girl like that would never write a diary of that nature.
Who made this investigation regarding the ballpoint pen writing?
Well, it was made on the basis of a trial which Mr. Otto Frank and his publisher in Germany made against a fellow at Hamburg, and this trial is still pending for good reasons. I think it's probably they are waiting for this man who's quite old to die, because it's so obvious that Anne Frank is a hoax.
This man that they're waiting for to die in Hamburg is someone who had claimed, as you do, that the diary of Anne Frank is a hoax, and her father and the publisher took him to court. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
And as a result of that court hearing, an investigation was made into the means of the writing of the book, and it was revealed that a ballpoint pen was used, which had not been invented at that time.
Yes, and I like to add here that Mr. Otto Frank gave this group who did the investigation plenty of difficulties.
Pedro Varela, a Spanish historian, librarian, and National Socialist, and former president of Spanish neo-Nazi SEDADE, spent 3 months in pretrial detention in Austria for giving a speech. Moroccan-Swedish author Ahmed Rami was a former tank lieutenant in the Royal Moroccan Army, made the claim that Moroccan King Hassan II was being controlled both by the Jews and the CIA. He was convicted and imprisoned for hate crimes due to his comments aired on his Radio Islam show. Jim Keegstra, a Canadian public school teacher, charged and convicted of hate speech in 1984 and survived an arson attempt for teaching his students that the Holocaust was a fraud. Frank Wallace survived multiple assassination attempts, was convicted of having been a Nazi who had assaulted Jews. Charges were dropped, and he was partially reimbursed in a civil trial. French author Henri Roques wrote about the role of Pope Pius VII during the Holocaust, had his doctorate degree revoked after leftist Jewish media attacked him. Roques argued that the alleged mass gassing of Jews was simply a baseless story. This was published by the Institute for Historical Review under the title The Confessions of Kurt Gerstein. Theodor Rudolph was convicted and imprisoned in his mid-80s for publishing a newsletter disputing the 6 million myth. He had been involved in organizing Red Cross inspections of these very camps. German historian and former soldier Udo Wallendi was imprisoned under Germany's incitement to hatred law for publishing books which questioned the Holocaust. Fred Luchter, an American manufacturer of execution equipment and author of the Luchter Report, known for his testimony in defense of Ernst Zundel, stated that no gas chambers had been used in Auschwitz. He was charged with misrepresenting his qualifications as an engineer and received 2 years probation. British historian David Irving has been jailed and deported from multiple countries due to his views on not just the Holocaust, but World War II.
Schmidt has said that only Hitler would benefit if a US-Japanese war broke out. If Japan made the first move, the war would be popular in America. Frankfurter, however, said, Germany has been smart in that she has consistently done everything possible to prevent arousing the United States. Therefore, regardless of how much the President tries to fan the anti-German flame, he cannot make the desired headway. Now, what a scandalous statement that is. Here's the one country, Germany, trying to prevent a war, the other country, Roosevelt, neutral, trying to fan the flame of anti-German feeling in order to create a war. Yet it's the Germans who are called the criminals, and the Americans who do the prosecuting.
Germar Rudolph was convicted as a Holocaust denier after having produced a report on the formation and verifiability of cyanide compounds in the Auschwitz gas chambers and sentenced to 14 months for inciting racial hatred, simply for proving that the presence of Zyklon B had to have left a blue residue, a residue that was not present at the so-called gas chambers. His doctorate was revoked,
and he was deported away from his family. Gary Schipper, Paul Ressignier, Emil Lackout, Ivan Lagache, Gerd Halsik, Imre Finte, Otto Hemer, Jerome Brentar, John Demjanjuk, Jürgen Reiger, Kirk Lyons, Bradley Smith, Michael Hoffman, Ingrid Weckert, Erhard Kemper, Gunther Deckert, Hans Schmidt, Jürgen Graf, Malcolm Ross, Dr. Ingrid Rimland Zundel, Nick Griffin, Jean-Marie Lapin, Doug Collins, Dr. Robert Countess, Robert Edwards. All of these people have experienced persecution, financial ruin, violence, death threats, or assassination attempts, prison time, or criminal charges, charges of hate crimes or inciting hatred, all for questioning the highly illogical and most likely mythical 6 million. In the United States, there would also be little tolerance for any pro-German or nationalist sentiment, even if it meant enforcing it by means of violence. In New York City, Judge Nathan D. Perlman had decided that anti-Semitism needed to be confronted in his city by any means necessary. Perlman was a Polish Jewish immigrant and former congressman who replaced the previous Fiorella H. LaGuardia after his resignation. And as a senior official of the American Jewish Congress, his eyes were set upon stamping out any notion of pro-German support. His focus? The German-American Bund, a latter formation of the Friends of New Germany. With the support of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, scores of Nazis would be tried as war criminals. But Perlman himself was more than willing to resort to unlawful tactics to ensure that any form of criticism towards Israel or the Jews would be dealt with harshly. In 1938, Perlman enlisted the help of Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky, originally from Belarus. Lansky came up the New York ranks with another famed Jewish mobster, American Ashkenazi Jew Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and eventually consolidated much of the New York mob syndicate under Charlie Lucky Luciano. For the most part, Lansky was a quiet, even-tempered, behind-the-scenes financier. But alongside Siegel, and with Luciano's might, the quest to dominate New York proved a violent one, but one that would elevate Lansky's status. Perlman needed Lansky's muscle to attack Bund members and disrupt their rallies. Lansky was more than happy to oblige. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise was even on hand to negotiate. "I want you to do anything but kill them." The Bund and the Silver Legion were the groups targeted most. Neither of them were widely known to commit violence. By the Depression era, more than 100 anti-Semitism groups existed in the United States. Why would so many need to exist? As for the German-American Bund, they were highlighted for their anti-Semitism and for their opposition to world communism, both considered to be connected. The claim was always that they were American citizens, looking out for America. When they had their rallies, there was always an American flag next to the swastika flag. A portrait of George Washington was next to the portrait of Hitler. The big party at Madison Square Garden was called the Pro-American Rally. They were going to make America great. From the times of Israel, fed up with the situation, Perlman took matters into his own hands. As a former congressman and justice of the Court of Special Sessions of the City of New York, his role in intimidating law-abiding Americans would have to be kept on the down low. So he requested the aid of men who wanted anti-Semites hurt and had no compunction about acting outside the law. Eventually, Perlman extended his deal towards Chicago and Al Capone's associate, Jake Greasy Thumb Gudzik, a Hungarian Jew from Galicia. Gudzik employed professional boxers like Jewish-American lightweight champion Barney Ross. Another one of them, a rough Jewish boxer by the name of Jacob Rubenstein, later known as Jack Ruby, who later became the killer of Lee Harvey Oswald. In New Jersey, Perlman's man was bootlegger Abner Longy Zwilman, a Russian Jew who also ran a lottery racket. Zwilman enlisted the help of boxer Nat Arno, real name Sidney Nathaniel Abramovitz. In Minnesota, a similar battle was occurring with William Dudley Pelley's Silver Legion, a Christian militia with the aim of spiritual renewal for the United States. Pelley was a former Hollywood screenwriter, and his belief
was that Hitler's rise was a fulfillment of his own prophecy in 1929. Pelé wanted to restructure the financial system in America to what he called Christian economics, neither communist nor fascist or capitalist. In this system, Jews would be expelled. He had spent time in Russia and detested Judeo-Bolshevism, saying that their Russian Revolution was really started by 276 Jews from New York's East Side. The Jewish-owned Hollywood was no longer interested in Pelé's ideas, and his silver shirts proved to be a growing threat in the Midwest. To deal with the 15,000 members, casino mogul and American Jewish gangster Davy the Jew Berman would collaborate with rival enforcer Romanian Jewish Isidor Kid Ken Blumenfeld. Jewish community institutions would organize with these gangsters to allow them to operate under what appeared to be legal means, but also gave the added muscle and confidence to ordinary Jews. Police and law enforcement turned a blind eye to beating after beating inflicted on everyday nationalist, sympathizing Americans. Americans who knew the international Jew would soon bring revolution and communism their way if something wasn't done about it. The Bund and Silver Front were outlawed and leaders arrested by America's entry into the war, and this story is often forgotten. This new era of Jewish gangster was not just being used as intimidation against nationalists, but to assist the pre-state Israeli government with their arm procurement and smuggling. The Jewish agency used this sprawling network under the direction of the Haganah, which later became the Israeli Defense Force. Hundreds of American Jews assisted this operation, based out of 14 East 60th Street, New York, at the Hotel 14. Longtime mayor of Jerusalem, Ted Kollek, oversaw the operation. The network of radio transmitters set up during the establishment of Palestine that would warn of British search parties would be set up in Brooklyn, thanks to the aid of Dan Flilderblum, who changed his name to David Avivi. David Ben-Gurion's aide, Yehuda Arazi, was sent to America to purchase the heavy armament, such as tanks and anti-aircraft guns. Arazi met with Brooklyn-based crime syndicate Murder Inc. to protect Israel's interest. At this time, the U.S. had an arms embargo against Israel and the Middle East, but the Mafia controlled the port of New York. Once again, Meyer Lansky would assist in loading ships with weapons bound for Israel while sabotaging ships bound for Egypt, often causing them to go overboard, only to be later retrieved and loaded onto ships destined for Israel. These ships were registered in Panama and operated quietly under a Panamanian flag. According to the biography of Jewish boxer turned mobster who called himself Irish Mickey Cohen, the activities with Israel had taken over almost all of his time, raising funds to procure more arms. Jewish bookmakers, actors, musicians, producers, bankers, mobsters, all coming together to pledge thousands for the illegal shipment of arms to Israel. I got involved with this goddamn Israel war for 3 years. Assisting Cohen, Irgun Yitzhak Ben Ami, who helped organize the fundraisers. Operations such as Operation Balak were also occurring in Europe, as arms being purchased to avoid being embargoed were transferred to the Yishuv, or residents of Israel. The name Balak is a reference to the Moabite king, meaning destroyer, the same Balak who met with the prophet Balaam, described in episode 2. These gangsters were able to successfully instill fear into the National Socialists through intimidation and violence, while using their organizations to unite and fundraise illegal funds and support Israel to help them win the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. By 1939, Jewish international media would do what the gangsters had hoped for: intimidate and quiet anyone who opposed the international Jewish agenda, an agenda that had dragged the world into a Second World War, an agenda that would expand into America and lay the groundwork for a new kind of revolution.
Hitler.